Coming up, we are going to talk about how you can manage and operate your Kubernetes clusters running on premises and at other cloud providers using Azure Arc. I'm here with Jason Hansen, Program Manager in the Azure Arc team. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Thomas. Happy to join you today.
Obviously, Azure Arc is a great tool and our customers depend a lot on Kubernetes clusters, but they're not just running them in Azure, they're running them on premises or at other cloud providers. So how can Azure Arc help them with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we're really trying to do with Azure Arc is to unlock the power of the Azure control plane. And by that, I mean all the investments that we made in management services, consistency of capabilities like role-based access control, and really extend those capabilities to other locations. And those other locations can include, on-premises data centers or managed service providers that you may be using, but also works across other cloud providers too.
So this is super interesting, and I know from like speaking with different architects and cloud architects in different companies that obviously they're not just running like an application or all their services in one place, and we see more and more these hybrid or multi-cloud architectures. And so, how can we actually leverage the power of Azure Arc in these cases?
Yeah, great question. So generally how this looks for an application architect who does need to run applications and infrastructure in lots of different places, you lay down the infrastructure, and then by deploying an Arc agent into that Kubernetes cluster, that cluster will attach to the Azure control plane and pulling that cluster up as a resource that you can see in the Azure portal. It gets a full MSI or managed server identity. It has an ARM ID, and as a resource within the context of Azure, you can do things like tag that resource. You can use role-based access control to control who can and can't have access to it. And the exciting thing is that also unlocks management services, stuff like Azure Policy, Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, really giving you the full breadth of the Azure platform to wrap your arms around what it means to run lots of clusters in lots of different locations. I've got a demo that shows what it looks like to attach a cluster to Azure. Let me go ahead and queue that up here, and we'll talk through what that looks like.
Sounds awesome.
Great. So here we're in the portal, and I've navigated to the Azure Arc Center. And I'm going to add some infrastructure and choose a Kubernetes cluster. Now, I need to provide a few parameters and inputs. I need to choose a subscription and a resource group for this cluster. I'll give it a name so that I can identify it, in the portal, and I'll choose a location that this cluster is associated with. Now, I can add some tags and metadata, and then the portal will generate a script that allows me to onboard it. Now, these are basic CLI commands, and I'm going to take these commands and I'm going to go ahead and use the Azure CLI to register the cluster in my terminal. So here I'm deploying the agent using the AZ connected K8s connect command. And what this is doing is setting up the Arc agentry in the Azure Arc namespace on my cluster. Now, the Arc agents deploy as any container workload, and so it should feel very familiar to Kubernetes native administrators. Now, once this agent starts, again, it registers with the platform and establishes that secure relationship between the control plane and my attached cluster. Now, navigating to the portal, I can see that resource, I can see that cluster in the resource group. I can apply tags, update and modify the tags. And see, basic metadata and information about the cluster. And again, these clusters can be anywhere. They can be on-prem, they can be on another cloud provider.
What I find great about this, well, there are multiple things I find obviously great about it. But first of all, the native integration of kind of like the agent, how you connect this up. And again, this makes obviously, if I'm a Kubernetes administrator, that makes me very happy that I can do it in the same manner I'm already used to do a lot of different things. And the other thing is really, this is not just like a connection and it shows up, as you mentioned at the beginning. This is really like, it becomes kind of like a native Azure resource. And as you said, this then obviously provides the whole benefits of having the Azure control plane. So this is pretty cool. The next thing I'm obviously want to talk about is like, what can developers do with it? How can developer access now that cluster, that Kubernetes clusters, and like deploy applications to it? So can you show me something there as well?
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, as a developer, you often need to use Kubernetes native tools to access your cluster. So that could be kube control, or that could be, even a CI/CD pipeline, for example. And in a hybrid and a multi-cloud context, often these clusters are spread over lots of different locations with different networking configurations. Now, one of the capabilities that Azure Arc for Kubernetes brings to the table is a feature we call Cluster Connect. And what Cluster Connect allows you to do is request access to any of these Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, and using a combination of Azure technologies, establish a secure connection from wherever you are to that Kubernetes cluster. Now, that means that the cluster's access is controlled by Azure Role-Based Access Control, that the end users are authenticated using Azure Active Directory, and that the network transport to that cluster is carried over Azure Hybrid Connections. Now, what this means is at the end of the day, you can use Kubernetes native tools to interact with that cluster. So I've got a demo. We'll go ahead and run through what that looks like. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm starting the proxy using AZ connected Kate's proxy. This again requests that endpoint and establishes that secure connection. And I'm using kube control at the top of the terminal here to get cluster information. I can then navigate that cluster using those standard tools, so getting a list of namespaces, for example. And I can also use other ecosystem tools that take a kube config as an input. Here, I'm using a tool called K9s, which allows me to interactively explore my Kubernetes cluster, and I'm navigating through the workloads that are deployed by Azure Arc. Again, this cluster is remote. I'm running this tool on my laptop, and access is seamless as if I were on the same network segment. So really exciting as a building block what the Cluster Connect capability really unlocks for developers and cluster administrators alike.
Okay, wow, this is awesome. Especially, it's not just a way of just connecting to to the clusters, but it also like really benefits now from Azure Active Directory and the role-based access control, and I can actually make sure that I have a centralized view of all my roles and admins and like people who actually can have access to the cluster. So I'm super excited about that one. Speaking of centralized management, I also know that obviously we have a lot of like IT pros who actually need to deploy these services. They need to go out and they need to manage and operate these clusters in different environments. Again, we also have, as I mentioned, you can run them on-prem, you can run that other cloud providers, and even we have a solution with AKS on Azure Stack HCI where we can actually help you deploy or get Azure Kubernetes Server within your data center. And then admins need to actually monitor these clusters. So is there also something there which makes that easier, like especially in these environments?
Yeah, that's a really great point. It was Kubernetes isn't just applications. There are a lot of concerns around that the customers need to tackle for the cluster infrastructure. And that can include monitoring and alerting, security, policy enforcement, and governance. And one of the nice things with Arc is that we can enable a lot of those capabilities from Azure to this infrastructure. I've got another demo here, and what we're going to see is we're going to dig in and look at what it means or how you can deploy something like Azure Monitor Container Insights to your connected clusters. And the capability that we're using from Arc-enabled Kubernetes is something we call cluster extensions. And cluster extensions is an API that allows you as a cluster operator or a developer, if you have sufficient permissions, to deploy these management solutions to your infrastructure. Those solutions, once deployed, can be automatically upgraded and updated by the platform as new versions become available. And with having a set of APIs to request these solutions to be installed means that you can integrate this into your automation environment. So let's go ahead and kick off that demo. So again, we're back in the Azure portal, and I've navigated to the Insights blade on the left-hand side. Now, I have an enabled monitoring, so I'm going to go ahead and click Configure Azure Monitor Container Insights. I select a log analytics workspace and click configure. And that's all I needed to do. The Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes platform behind the scenes uses that secure connection and installs the Azure Monitor Container Insights extension. And here you can see the status being pulled up, its current version, and whether or not automatic upgrades are enabled or not. Now let's go ahead and look at the cluster and see what's happening under the covers. Now I've got a custom resource definition called extension configs, which maps one-to-one to these instances of the extension, and watching it install here. Just a few moments, click refresh, and you'll see that the extension is moved from pending to installed, which means that the solution is up and ready to go. We can now navigate to that Insights blade again, and you can see that we are ready to start receiving metrics from the cluster. So really quick and easy to enable solutions.
Wow, okay, this is really, really cool stuff. I mean, again, me as an administrator or former administrator, this makes me so happy. It looks really like now I'm administrating a resource which actually runs in Azure, but it can basically run everywhere. So that is awesome. And then you also talked about policies, obviously, which helps me to actually make sure that things are compliant in that environment. Now, I know there's probably more for security engineers and people who are responsible for compliance. So what else do we offer there?
Yeah, great question. There are some other management services that we've talked about, and I'll dig in and show those. So in this next demo, we'll take a look at policy, Azure Defender for Kubernetes, and a little bit of monitoring again as well. This is an AKS HCI cluster, which means we've installed AKS on top of Azure Stack HCI, and we've enabled a number of these management solutions. We'll kind of go through them one by one. Again, the goal with Arc is to bring all of this information across all of my clusters into one place. And that one place is Azure and powered by the Azure control plane. So let's go ahead and pull up this demo. So here we've got an AKS HCI cluster, as I mentioned. You can see it in the portal, and again, all of the metadata that is flowing up. Now, let me go ahead and navigate to the extensions view here. And here you can see all of the solutions that we've installed: monitoring, Defender, policy. Again, we can navigate to monitoring here. And this cluster has been streaming metrics and logs for quite some time. So here we can see visualized in terms of a chart. We can navigate to, say, the nodes and view and explore the nodes that are a part of this AKS HCI cluster. And we can go ahead and configure, some baseline alerts. Here we've got nodes going not ready, and controllers that are restarting too frequently. Those can be send notifications to a notification group. Now, if we go to the security tab, this is bringing in the Azure Defender for Kubernetes view. And what Azure Defender for Kubernetes can do is make a set of recommendations for best practices configuration for your cluster. It can also actively monitor and view the security incidents or things that Defender has noticed, like, for example, a new cluster admin role being created. Last but not least, we can go to policy. And here we have a policy. We can assign policies to our cluster, which means that the Azure policy engine is making sure that our clusters are configured appropriately and kept up to date. And so in this case, what I'm doing is I'm adding a policy to ensure that no privileged containers or high privileged containers can be started. Now, if I apply this policy, it'll be pushed down to all of my clusters and will monitor and ensure that no privileged containers are started. Now, additionally, we can also use policy to attach configurations to our clusters. So I can assign a policy here that says, this GitOps configuration should be associated with this cluster, which makes sure that all of my clusters are kept up to date with the appropriate configuration. And again, monitoring the posture and disposition across, metrics and logs, security and configuration from one place in the Azure portal is really, again, the goal here.
Okay, wow. Again, very impressive. Not just that we actually get all these management tools which we need to actually manage Kubernetes clusters, but we also have a lot of tools and a lot of benefits actually by connecting these. I mean, I still love the Azure Security Center recommendations, which actually make sure that if I, for example, forgot something, right? I mean, most of the IT administrators, they know how to secure Kubernetes clusters. They're aware of it, but you can always forget, or someone does a change and you're not aware of it anymore, and Security Center can do a great job there. No, I absolutely love it. People are now hopefully as excited as I am about that. And so where can they find more?
Yeah, great question. And we've spent a lot of time across a number of resources to help people get started. And I'd say the first place to head is definitely the Microsoft Docs site. So we have Azure Arc Kubernetes Docs site with quick starts and examples. We've also spent a bunch of time in the Azure Arc Jumpstart repository that has a number of getting started examples, Terraform scripts, for you to provision a demo environment and really get your hands dirty to kick the tires and see how this stuff works. And last but not least, Microsoft Learn, which has a series of modules that walk you through from sort of zero to hero so that you can skill up across these various areas.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jason. And for everyone watching here, if you want to learn more about multi-cloud or hybrid architectures, check out our Cloud Adoption Framework and the Azure Architecture Center.